So I am on a train to the Sachsenhausen camp, which was a concentration camp back during the time of the Second World War.
Hey, this is Trey. I'm playing a little bit of diary audio from my visit to Germany back in 2017. As I rode the train from Berlin, a tour guide pointed out that I was riding on the same rail tracks that Nazis used to transport prisoners to Sachsenhausen. Most of us have an idea in our minds when we hear the phrase concentration camp. Often it's the kind of place that I'm traveling to see right now.
Endstation. Bitte alle aussteigen.
Attention please. We are now approaching the last stop on the line. All passengers are requested to leave the train.
So we're walking from the train station, and I'm told that the prisoners, they would have walked from the train station through this charming town of Oranienburg, and they would walk to the Sachsenhausen camp.
Oranienburg is a quaint suburban town with wide tree-lined streets. There's lots of shops and restaurants, and little cozy houses with peaked red tile roofs surrounded by fences with clipped shrubs.
Back in the time of the Third Reich, they would march the prisoners through this town along this street. And I'm told that the residents of this town would have seen the prisoners walk by daily, to and from work. Sometimes factories, sometimes building a movie theater or something like that in the town.
I tried to imagine what was in the minds of Germans living in Oranienburg in the late 1930s. Their country was at war, and the Nazi machine picked who was a good German and who wasn't. We've seen this official ussing and theming time and time again. Chairman Mao's policies identified who should be reformed through labor. And the George W. Bush administration told us who were the evildoers and the worst of the worst, and what should become of them. And as we'll learn in this episode, surrendering to the official dictates of who is good and who is bad is easier than we'd like, even today. From West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX, this is Us and Them. It's the podcast where we tell stories from America's, and for today, the world's culture war divides. I'm Trey K. Walking through Oranienburg and then across the grounds of Sachsenhausen, I thought a lot about how so many of our episodes are about the tribal mentality of humans and our propensity for clustering and sorting, and the ways we decide who's in and who's out. I couldn't help thinking that places like Sachsenhausen are examples of the us and them dynamic taken to the most vile extreme.
A lot of the way you get to concentration camps is prefaced, before you get to that moment. There has to be a lot of work done to make that us and them divide so deep that people are willing to cause harm to other human beings.
That's journalist Andrea Pitzer, author of One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. In her book, Pitzer examines all kinds of camps that governments have erected throughout history. It's a particular kind of tribal sorting.
For purposes of the book, the definition of concentration camp is a mass detention of civilians without trial, usually on the basis of ethnicity or race or religion or party membership, but preemptive, not necessarily that people have done things.
Pitzer reminds us that the process of carving people off from the rest of society is not part of human nature.
People have to be taught to do this. A party or a government has to train people to see that other group as so distinct and so worthy of some kind of contempt or abuse that then the main group that's in control is willing to put them in camps. So it's a real process that has to happen.
Now, you'd think that the model of a concentration camp is as old as the ages. I mean, people have been enslaved, imprisoned, and tortured for millennia, right? But Pitzer concludes that a few key characteristics distinguish concentration camps from other types of imprisonment. Her research has found one unifying quality is that concentration camps extract people from one area to house them somewhere else. Often detainees are held in camps without a scheduled day of release. Usually in the wake of a crisis, internment camps keep people for a fixed or indefinite amount of time. Then there are transit camps, where people considered undesirable by a dominant government are deported to another region. And there are labor camps, where people are forced to work. And then there are extermination camps, where people are cut off from sustenance or murdered outright. Of course, history has shown that camps can be any combination of these types. All of these camps have an official justification. Some were designed to deliver punishment, but dressed up with the intent to civilize what is considered an inferior culture. A few camps were formed with the intent of holding people to protect them from public anger. But most camps were designed to prevent a suspect group from committing a crime, real or imagined. Andrea Pitzer says the practice of camps began in Cuba.
The very first camps, the very first time you have this phrase, it was in Spanish originally, reconcentración, which in English is very quickly translated as concentration camps. It arises in the 1890s in Cuba under the Spanish Empire.
In 1896, General Valeriano Weyler was sent by the Spanish Empire to thwart a rebellion of insurgents who'd been fighting against Spanish rule for decades. As governor of Cuba, General Weyler set up the reconcentración system.
The governor general there decides that the only way to defeat these people is to basically shoot everybody that you think is an insurgent, and in order to find those people, to sweep all the peasants out of the countryside and put them behind barbed wire in loyalist towns. So they were in with the general population, but they were on the outskirts and they were living in horrific conditions. So it's not quite the segregated camps we think of where you really isolate people today, but they were sort of internally isolated. Their crops were burned, their homes were taken, they had nothing, they had no way to make a living, and they had no food. So they starved to death. And so there's this moment in history where these camps emerge, and it's on Cuba.
From history class, I remember that it was the sinking of the battleship USS Maine that drew us into that war.
Everyone thinks of the sinking of the Maine as the trigger that brings us into the war, and it is the trigger. But the reason the U.S. is ready to go to war is because they have been hearing horrific newspaper reports and accounts of what's going on in these camps, and the people are starving and dying literally in the streets. And Spain is really cast as a pretty horrific villain. And so the U.S. is already all ginned up against what Spain is doing.
But consider this. Cuba's General Weyler, who established the concentration camp system, claimed to be copying the battle tactics of American Civil War generals, specifically William Tecumseh Sherman's devastating March to the Sea, which broke the back of the Confederacy and led to its eventual surrender.
You see the general, who's nicknamed the Butcher, who prosecutes that war and launches the first camps, literally saying there is no difference in what the U.S. did in that war and what I am doing now.
Pitzer says Weyler's strategy was an evolution of the Scorched Earth campaign that Generals Sherman and Sheridan used to eviscerate Confederate states, which left civilians starving, homeless, or dead.
There was this idea, leave them nothing but their eyes to weep with, to literally burn the crops, burn the homes, to affect and afflict the civilian population so that they themselves would not want their fighters, their insurgents, to continue. I think the Civil War is this moment of total war where we decide that, in this case, for a really good cause, an end to slavery, this would be the moment to insist on total victory, complete surrender from your enemy, that you get to dictate the terms. And yet, the things that we excused in that war, in the pursuit of this really noble thing, were picked up and used in later conflicts.
U.S. Senator John Sherman, the younger brother of General Sherman, didn't see that General Weyler's concentration camps were on the same moral plane as the Civil War. And he was outraged by General Weyler's treatment of more than 300,000 Cuban citizens. Senator Sherman wrote that Weyler's hands are forever stained with the blood of defenseless women and children. Congress voted to go to war against Spain on April 25, 1898.
We land in 1898 at the start of that war at Guantanamo Bay. That's the point we go in through, and we never leave.
America emerged victorious from the 10-week Spanish-American War, and as a result, we ended up occupying Cuba and the Philippines. President William McKinley and his administration now faced the weighty challenges of managing the Philippines, located on the far side of the globe. To tamp down a popular revolt, they took a page from the Spanish playbook and set up concentration camps. The camps were filthy, littered with disease and death, conditions which one U.S. soldier likened to a suburb of hell. The detainees were tortured, and because this was not on American soil, they were denied any legal processes. And as we will learn, these features would reemerge almost exactly 100 years later, again at the hands of Americans during a crisis. The first decade of concentration camps unfolded at the dawn of two technologies that helped make them more lethal over time: the mass production of barbed wire and automatic weapons.
Both of those things combined to allow you to hold a large group of people with a very small guard force in a way it wasn't possible before. So there's this moment of technology that is kind of a tipping point that allows camps to happen.
In the early 20th century, both Germany and Britain ran concentration camps in southern Africa. As the First World War progressed, the sun never set on concentration camps, as the practice expanded throughout the vast British Empire. Eventually, Stalinist Russia would adopt the practice and place their own countrymen in gulags. Of course, the most infamous camp system was deployed by the Nazis during the Second World War. Whereas the Nazis established their camps over time, the Japanese internment camps in America seemed like a swift reflexive response to the attack on Pearl Harbor.
We interned Japanese Americans, not just enemy aliens, but Japanese Americans who were American civilians. Some 70,000 were interned in the U.S., just as like locking you or me up. Those people should have had the same rights, but because of the Pearl Harbor bombing, camps become the response of that.
I'd always thought that the Roosevelt administration had rounded up Japanese Americans and placed them into camps out of a knee-jerk sense of panic after Pearl Harbor. Pitzer says this wasn't the case. She says there was an intelligence officer who'd been keeping tabs on a Japanese spy ring. He claimed to have busted the group a few months before Pearl Harbor and had identified almost all the people that were of concern.
He had lived in Japan for a time. He was very tied into the community on the West Coast, and he wrote a report saying that most of the people who were dangerous were known and belonged to organizations that were understood to be cooperating with Japanese government. It would be against American interests and also unfair to intern everybody. He wrote a report that was handed to the highest levels in the military circles at the time. The Attorney General was on his side. J. Edgar Hoover was on his side. Eleanor Roosevelt was very much on their side, and for a time, Franklin Roosevelt was. But the pressure of politicians and people who wanted to make something out of this, create the us and them, they were able to pressure the general who was in charge of this zone, and he ended up being neutral at first and then moving to a position where he said, after all, a Jap is a Jap. So it was not an inevitable moment of panic that did it. It was a concerted effort by some people to sway the general, who would then have the leverage to assert military control, which in times of crisis, we tend to want the military to deal with those situations so that they aren't tied with a lot of bureaucracy and they aren't slowed down.
Reading Pitzer's book, I find myself getting chills thinking about being on the wrong side of an us and them struggle, where my kind is considered a them by an us majority, and that they've concluded that the best solution for society would be to have my kind rounded up and removed.
You said the mentality to round up people and put them into camps, that it's not something that you believe is innate in humans, that it's something that is really political, that we have to learn to do this. And so is it common for leaders to raise public concern about the alleged heinous actions of these them people, to start the process to say we need to kind of isolate these people? Is that kind of how it starts?
Yes, I mean, there is almost always some prefiguring crisis that has to be solved or dealt with. There are sort of two ways it starts. One way is if you have a big event, a Lusitania sinking, a Pearl Harbor, a 9/11, then you can come in very quickly and say big things fast because people are scared and they're very responsive to it. If you're not rising out in the immediate wake of a kind of a terror attack type situation, then it has to start more slowly. For instance, with the Nazis, they started camps in their very first weeks. They were putting people into improvised camps. And that same spring, when they come to power, Dachau is opened as a purpose-built, indefinitely maintained concentration camp. But they have to make the German Jews, who have been an integrated part of society, distance. It takes years before the Jews themselves are targeted as a whole group to be in the camps. So they target them first in society. They remove them from being able to be university professors or have public jobs or use, public spaces. It's this slow isolation of them, stripping of citizenship.
Basically saying we are us and they are them.
Right. But the way you do that is you try to pick out whatever, because of course we all have communities and we all have identifying characteristics. So you start to pick those characteristics as the ones that are a problem. That art is decadent. Those ideas are not German. Hitler, he embraced this idea of animal rights and being against cruelty to animals. So Jews were portrayed, because of their kosher practices and slaughtering, as perverted and cruel and tormentors of animals and sadistic. And so any difference will suffice if you lean on it hard enough. But it takes time.
Pitzer's book is chock full of historical examples of both the slow and quick way camps come into being, like the Japanese internment, when the call and justification for opening camps was accompanied by the paranoid mantra of extreme times call for extreme measures. Another good example would be after World War I, when Britain reviewed the effectiveness of their camp system.
The British did end up doing universal internment. And then after the war, they assessed it and they said, that was really unproductive. It didn't prevent any, the big fear was espionage. It didn't prevent any of that. We broke up a lot of communities. It ruined a lot of people's lives. It took a lot of money and a lot of guards when we needed them doing other things. And so if this happens again, we're not going to do it a second time.
But then World War II breaks out and there's fear of invasion. And the same rhetoric of extreme times calling for extreme measures leads the Brits to intern Germans living in England.
What was interesting this second time was that many of the Germans who were in the country at that moment were German Jews who had managed to get out of Germany. So they ended up locking up Nazi sympathizers in the same camps with German Jews who had fled. And the optics of this were so obviously nuts that as people who were, activists or journalists started calling attention to this, that this was a terrible response and this was a cowardly response, Britain was sort of shamed out of it, and they began releasing many of these prisoners, but not before they had deported thousands of them to Canada and Australia and, still changing these people's lives. Now, it's important to say this was not Auschwitz. The danger of looking at all these camps as a whole is that you make everything the same. What Britain did in the war, what we did in the war was very different than the level of what the Nazis were doing or even Soviet camps. But in that case, Britain knew it was against their ideals. And they did it again because this argument about extreme times is followed. And what I found with the book is that it usually causes many more problems than it solves. It isn't just like, we'll violate their rights for a time, but this is what we need to do. It actually often makes the problem worse.
Author and journalist Andrea Pitzer. After a short break, she'll take us back to where the story of concentration camps began, Cuba. And she'll tell us why she's included the U.S. detention center at Guantanamo in her history of concentration camps.
For a long period of time, we aren't even public about what we call them or anything because we're so careful to give them no rights.
I'm Trey Kay, and this is Us and Them, which is supported in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation.
Music lifts us up and brings us together, even when we can't get together in person. Mountain Stage brings you live performances on the air, online, and in our podcast. They remind you how it feels to be in a live audience listening to live music. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find a link to our stations and our podcast online at mountainstage.org.
When we think of concentration camps, we tend to have a specific idea about the setting. World War II, the Holocaust, striped uniforms, yellow stars of David, forced labor, starving, gas chambers. And all of this happened somewhere else, over there. After 9/11, we opened a detention camp at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, to deal with unlawful enemy combatants, those people that we were hunting down in the war on terror. In theory, Gitmo was a prisoner of war camp. In reality, it has become, in Andrea Pitzer's words, a concentration camp on steroids.
What I originally started out thinking was that I would see how it did and didn't fit into that tradition, because I thought perhaps it was sort of a 21st century new version of what we would do.
Since the world has advanced in know-how and technology, Pitzer thought we'd create a camp that would be significantly different from previous wars and times.
And what I found is it actually neatly fit into the evolution of these kinds of camps at the end of the 20th century. So while it is sort of the 21st century face of what I think is next, I think it's also not as distinct as I originally thought it was.
After 9/11, America was in wounded tiger mode.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
President George W. Bush's approval rating shot up 35 points in the days after 9/11. And it was clear that he was appealing to a great number of Americans who wanted vengeance. Looking back at that time, when the president stood on the rubble of the fallen Twin Towers and addressed first responders through a bullhorn, it was clear that this was one of those big events that Andrea Pitzer was referring to. This was a time like the sinking of the Lusitania passenger ship or the bombing of Pearl Harbor. This was a time when emotions were at a fevered pitch and things were moving very quickly.
I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice.
There's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said, "Wanted, dead or alive."
Terrorists who once occupied Afghanistan now occupy cells at Guantanamo Bay.
The U.S. leads a coalition invasion into Afghanistan and starts rounding up suspects the government believes might have had something to do with the attacks on September 11th, or may have knowledge of additional imminent attacks. These suspects eventually get shipped to Cuba.
In terms of the people who are brought there, even Bush-era people who worked on this later say there was not a vetting process that should have happened. So not only did we not observe the laws of war, we didn't even really vet people before they went.
And so what happens, Pitzer says, is that you have this 23-year-old captain in Afghanistan who suddenly is in charge of deciding whether or not this guy in custody is dangerous.
Do you let this guy go and take a chance that he's Osama bin Laden's right-hand man and you just missed it somehow? Or do you say, no, we'll send him to Guantanamo? Who wants to be the person making that decision? Because there's not a real good process in place for how you're going to do that. So, boom, they end up in Guantanamo. So you had a tremendous number of an undifferentiated population of people who might have been real suspects and people who didn't belong there at all. And so that's where it sort of creeps from being what most people think of as a prisoner of war camp into something that's actually this undifferentiated population. We did not know who we had.
For her book, Andrea Pitzer interviewed Mark Fallon, a veteran NCIS agent. He was deputy commander of the Criminal Investigation Task Force, charged with bringing suspected terrorists to justice. He oversaw the first interrogations at Guantanamo.
The way he described it is, we thought we were going to get these high-value detainees that we were ready to question, but we didn't get high-value detainees. We didn't get low-value detainees. We got no-value detainees, is the way he described it. Now, later, you have the suspects that were held elsewhere and tortured elsewhere in black sites. You have the 9/11-5. You have these other people that are brought in that were high-level suspects. But those first people that came, many of them should never have been there.
This is perhaps where Guantanamo is like other camps of old. Pitzer says that it's part of the same political impulse that interned Japanese Americans in World War II. Only this time we're calling it the War on Terror, and it's fueled by the legitimate fear of another 9/11-style attack.
The anxiety over finding the people who did that and trying to prevent another one that might be in the works is so huge that we throw away the law of war. And because we don't follow those guidelines, our own ideals, but also the international framework for how to deal with these situations, we end up detaining all these people that have nothing to do with it. People that have the wrong name, people that were in the region that normally wouldn't be in the region, but they are suspicious to us because they speak a different language than should be spoken in the region. And I think it makes sense, perhaps, to stop and question all of these people. It's not an unreasonable thing to do in a post-9/11 setting, but we don't have a great detention policy set in place before we start doing it. So it happens very randomly.
So if, as Pitzer says, we didn't have a sound detention policy, it follows that rounding up the right people became messy. On the other hand, the process to detain someone indefinitely was calculated.
So when we first detained all these people, we didn't give them a name. And the people running Guantanamo were very careful about how they referred to them. They didn't refer to them as prisoners of war because we weren't going to give them those rights. They had never been put through the Geneva Convention process that would normally happen when you detain people because we wanted the liberty to interrogate them. So for a long period of time, we aren't even public about what we call them or anything because we're so careful to give them no rights.
And part of what makes us throw away or suppress our democratic ideals is that it's easy for us to see people who come from other places, don't speak our language, don't adhere to the dominant religion of America, as them.
Certainly a lot of the rhetoric that we hear around the Muslim ban and things like that has echoes of anti-Semitic rhetoric that was used a century ago because, of course, don't forget, after the Russian Revolution, there was a tremendous identification of European Jews as anarchists and bombers and terrorists, literally terrorists. That idea that we just have to do something to deal with the terrorists is at the heart of almost every camp system that has ever arisen in more than 100 years. Because it's that feeling that something has to be done, there's no good thing to do, so we'll do this, has led to unimaginable suffering around the world.
That's journalist Andrea Pitzer, author of One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. In the next episode of Us and Them, we'll hear a first-hand account of the Guantanamo experience from two people, a former detainee and his guard.
Sometimes He'd bring a chessboard and play chess together.
He taught me how to play chess better than I was playing.
It wasn't in my cell, it was outside, so I'd have to tell them which pieces to move.
And he beat me like 23 times.
First time I ever saw the film Snatch with Brad Pitt was in Guantanamo, because Albert
snuck in. DVD player, DVDs.
You know, we'd make each other laugh. He'd make me laugh.
Just like I was the Three Stooges. Hey, Mo, what's up? How you doing? I see you move from one side of the bed to the other.
And it was these little acts of humanity.
Jokes to make them laugh. Just, you know.
It didn't harm the military's mission in any way. But what it did do is that people like me didn't leave Guantanamo hating every single American. That's what it did.
You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team is me, Trey K, Loretta Williams, Lori Stern, and Mitch Hanley. Special thanks to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Michael Lipton and Tristan Lozow wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Additional music in this episode by Blue Dot Sessions. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The wonderful people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the West Virginia Humanities Council, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
From PRX.